Okay. Okay. So welcome everyone to the Online Peace Science Colloquium. My name is Cassy Dorff. I'm an assistant professor at Vanderbilt University, and I co-host this online colloquium with Brad Smith, who is also at Vanderbilt University. This workshop series is associated with the Peace Science Society, and our mission is to advance research before and after the Peace Science meetings and to really help facilitate engagement with broader audiences through the use of this online platform, as well as give some great comments to our presenters. So today we have Juan from University of South Carolina, and he will be presenting his research, Wartime Displacement as Land Grabbing, Evidence from Colombia. We have some fantastic discussions joining us today. So we'll be hearing from Thomas Flores at George Mason University, Jonathan Pinckney, who is a postdoctoral research fellow at the Norwegian University of Science and Technology, and Javier Osorio from the University of Arizona. So Juan will have you share your screen, and you'll have about 15 minutes to present your paper, and then we'll just open the floor to some comments, give some brief feedback, and sort of generate a discussion from there. We will try to wrap up in exactly an hour from now. So Juan, the floor is yours.
Perfect. Thanks so much. Everyone can hear me okay? Great. So yeah, just before getting started here, say thanks to everyone for participating, and to sort of reiterate what a great format this is, having some really smart people paying careful attention to my work is something that's very very rare, and I'm glad we have this format to do this kind of work. Okay, and so the paper I'm presenting today, as Cassy said, Wartime Displacement is Land Grabbing. The way I'm going to talk about this paper today, I'm going to jump in and talk about the motivation for the paper. In particular, these sort of two ideas in the literature, one that wartime behavior is sometimes driven by private motives, and then the other, this big literature on the effect that commodity shocks have on conflict. I'm going to look at these two ideas within a very particular context of the growth of this one industry in Colombia and what effect that had on the conflict there. Then I'll lay out the argument as to what effect I expect that growth to have, focusing on these ideas of factors of production, the fog of war, and the behavior of elites in these settings. And then I'll essentially generate expectations about how the growth of this industry will have an effect on the rates of displacement that we see in the country. Then I'll turn to the empirics, where I have municipal data that I've collected, a survey, and then also some ethnographic accounts of this process taking place in Colombia and elsewhere. Okay, so in terms of the motivation, I'm really interested in this idea put forth by Tellez and others, which essentially says that violence and civil wars often appears more related to local and private issues than to the wars driving cleavage, which is to say that, the war from a sort of 10,000 feet in the air view looks very different from the war on the ground. We often associate conflict with these sort of big stories of left versus right, or sort of the big motivating drivers of rebel groups. But on the ground, violence is often a function of just people pursuing their own personal interests or private feuds or local cleavages, right? And in this vein, we have this big literature on the politics of denouncement that shows that civilians often use wartime as an avenue to pursue private interests that are, at best tangential to the war, sometimes completely unrelated to the war. We have examples from many different settings of people using sort of conflict settings to pursue private interests, to attack enemies in a way that's unrelated to the actual war effort itself. But a lot of this research, to me, really focuses on civilians, and in particular non-elites, and how non-elites might use the fact that there is a war going on to sort of settle small local feuds. And there isn't as much of an emphasis on how elites might take advantage of wartime to pursue their own interests, even though we have, a lot of evidence from different historical cases that elites engage in all types of wartime economic activity, such as contraband and black markets. So we have a lot of research to say on how non-elites pursue their interests during war, but a lot less on how elites do it, even though there's reason to think they do it as well. And then the second literature I'm drawing on is this big literature on commodity shocks and conflict, which says that, economic changes might have different effects on conflict in places that are undergoing war. And very often these stories are very bottom up in nature, these theories of commodity shocks and their effects on conflict, where the basic story is that, these economic shocks make either work or war more attractive to potential rebels. So the economic shock has some kind of effect on wages, and that shifts people either from working in the fields or, joining the rebellion. And this has downstream consequences for the level of conflict that we observe. That's more or less the basic story in this literature. But to me, I think there's also room here for a top-down story, which we don't tell as much, which again focuses on elites and how they might respond to different kinds of economic shocks. And in particular, the idea that economic shocks might produce conflict through elites in a way that's unrelated to the labor supply of conflict, okay, in a way that is unrelated to people rebellion rates. Examples of this from all over the world. Here we're looking at an example from a Chinese mining company and the DRC using armed groups to extract gold. And so there's a sort of general idea here that war could create all sorts of opportunities for elites to profit from. And like I mentioned earlier, I'm looking at this in a very particular and the growth of this one. So palm oil is a commodity that's in everything from biodiesel to household goods. For a very long time, Colombia produced very little amounts of this, but over the span of about a decade and a half, Colombia rises to become one of the largest producers of this good in the world, spurred along by a lot of investment from private industry and also some investment from the state. So there's an interesting question here as to what effect the boom of this industry had on the conflict. And so the very narrow question I'm interested in here is, what effect did this boom have on conflict dynamics? But the bigger thing that I'm after here is this more general story about how elites use wartime to accumulate resources. And so then in terms of the argument, I'm really taking as a starting point this very influential model by Dalbo and Dalbo that says that the effect of commodity shocks on conflict is going to depend on the type of industry where that shock takes place, whether it's more labor intensive or capital intensive. That's going to have different effects on conflict. And when it comes to palm oil, what's sort of interesting about palm oil is that it's a very, very land intensive industry. You have these huge plantations that someone needs to build in order to make production profitable. There's also very low labor needs relative to capital, to the size of land. So there's a huge need for land, and there's a sense that this boom is going to create lots of incentives for elites in these industries to accumulate land. And that accumulation could take many different forms. What I argue in this paper is that a set of factors are going to mean that elite accumulation is going to be in the form of violent expropriation, or what we might call land grabbing from other literatures. And the reason I think that this sort of thirst for land is going to result in expropriation is that the sort of the specific context of war, the fog of war, provides opportunities for elites to expropriate. If people are being displaced or they're losing the land in the middle of their land in the middle of a conflict, it's very easy to sort of blame that process on just the general, just a general byproduct of the war, when in fact it's something that's being specifically and strategically made to happen. We're also talking about how in the context of war, it's very, very difficult for the state to enforce people's property rights. So we have a setting of very weak property rights. And then very often in these settings, we also have collusion between armed groups and elites, where elites can sometimes hire armed groups or work with armed groups to accomplish different types of goals. And we've seen that both in the specific context of Colombia, and collusion between paramilitaries and different kinds of politicians and regional elites, but also in other settings. And then finally, one question we might have here is, well, if you expropriate land from all these people to expand production of this commodity, where is the labor going to come from? And again, I think a particular quality of African palm in this case is that it's so relatively non-intensive in labor compared to land that I think there's really no need, or there isn't really as much of a need. The payoff of getting more land is greater than the payoff of maintaining a workforce. And so my expectation that I build in the paper is that the growth of this industry is going to generate displacement in Colombia. And I look at this in two different ways in the paper. The first is some municipal data that I've collected on the timing of palm oil adoption over time in municipalities, so when and where it happens, and then also displacement rates when and where it happens. I also look at subsidies that the state produced for the production of palm oil, but I'm not going to talk about that today. In terms of the analysis, what I end up doing is essentially a difference in difference strategy, right? Where I'm exploiting variation in when and where palm oil adoption is happening, and then controlling for municipality and year fixed effects, so that I'm only looking at palm.
Hey, Juan.
Controls and an instrument. Yeah.
You might want to repeat that. You broke up for a second.
The analysis part.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I'm basically pursuing a difference in difference strategy here, where I have municipal and year fixed effects, and I'm exploiting variation in when and where municipalities are first adopting palm oil. So the timing of that first adoption of palm oil. And I'm looking at what happens to the displacement rate in a municipality as that municipality goes from not producing palm oil to producing palm oil. I have different kinds of controls that also vary across time, including the presence of gorillas and coca. I also have an instrumental variable strategy that looks at climate. I can talk about that if people are interested. And then I also have separately a survey in high conflict areas of the country where I have a lot of respondents who were displaced during the war. And there I'm able to just aggregate their displacement experience and ask them about who was the perpetrator, what were their motives, how much land people held before they were displaced, these kinds of questions. And so, very quickly, what I find just in the first column here is in evidence that, as municipalities adopt palm oil, they experience more and more displacement. This effect, this displacement effect that palm oil has, increases both in the size of the plantation. So in years when the palm oil industry is expanding most rapidly, that's when we see the most displacement. And then it also seems to depend on the level of paramilitary control at the municipal level. And so we know that a lot of regional elites, the kinds of people who would be engaged in this industry, had connections to paramilitary groups. and that paramilitary groups might be a big source of displacement in this context. And we see here as well that the displacement effect of palm oil expansion is increasing in paramilitary control, is worse in areas where paramilitaries have had a longer history of presence in the area. And then turning to the survey results, what I find is that, one, overall, respondents from palm oil regions are more likely to have been displaced during the conflict than respondents from other parts of the country. And then if we look among those who were displaced, people from palm areas were more likely to say that they were displaced for their land, that was the motive behind the perpetrator displacing them, that they were displaced by elites or paramilitaries, and that they are now facing a restitution opponent. And I can talk about that more if people are interested, but it's really interesting because restitution is such a big issue in Colombia right now as part of the post-conflict process. And then, so the last finding from the survey that I want to highlight is that, again, if we look among those who were displaced, people from palm areas tended to have larger land holdings than their counterparts, larger farms, essentially, before they were displaced, which again points in the direction that they were being displaced for their land in particular, and not just as a sort of general side effect of the conflict. And then I have, well, I also spent a little bit of time in the paper trying to sort of close off different avenues. So one idea might be that palm oil is actually causing poverty, which in turn is producing the conflict that we're observing. I do an analysis using a rural household panel where I find that there actually is no evidence that palm oil expansion is depressing wages. I also look at whether it's possible that peasants from palm areas were just simply more likely to be rebel supporters. I have an experiment embedded in the survey where I find no evidence of more rebel support among citizens from these areas. And then I also look at a couple of different ethnographic accounts of people describing being displaced from their homes, either by paramilitaries or by some kind of armed, thug, essentially, and describing this process of being displaced, and then finding out much later that the whole county has been the whole area where they used to live has been planted with palm oil. This is not just in Colombia, but it's also happening in Guatemala. In this really nice book talking about how these big agricultural companies, in conjunction with drug trafficking organizations, are displacing people from their homes or intimidating them to sell their homes as a way to accumulate more land. And then finally, I also just interestingly found references to this in WikiLeaks, reports from Bogota going back to DC, saying that we have lots of reports here of essentially these African palm oil companies using armed force to seize peasants' lands, often paramilitaries, but sometimes also drug trafficking organizations. And so the sort of big key takeaway here, one is that the fog of war, the experience of being in wartime, might facilitate elites advancing their own private interests, and that we need a lot more work on how elites and industry might respond is not necessarily only about territorial control. It can also be a form of work on displacement currently, territorial conquest angle. And so I think this should really caution us against necessarily interpreting or imposing political motives on the wartime violence that we observe happening in different countries. And then finally, I think this paper also speaks to this commodity shocks literature, in that it argues that commodity shocks might also generate violence through channels that are completely top down. And in particular, that in the absence of strong property rights, growth could actually induce predation of elites by predation of non-elites by elites. So that's where I'll end it. And I think that's good, right? 16, 17 minutes.
Yeah, I think we're good. Thank you for that presentation. You can just unshare your screen and then we'll get comments first from Javier.
I'm back, right?
Yeah, just make sure you unmute yourself, Javier.
Is that better? All right. Sorry about that. Good morning, everybody. Juan, this is a really interesting paper. I have a bunch of comments. I will not monopolize the mic, so I'm just going to give you the most important things. First one, probably a conceptual and also empirical distinction between land grabbing and displacement. They're not necessarily the same thing, and they don't happen at the same time. And even when we talk about land grabbing, it's important to break it down what we mean by it. Because we have, particularly in Colombia, two different types of land dynamics. One is land abandonment, when people are pushed out, actually landowners, because not everybody owns land, right? Landowners are pushed out, but they keep the title of their lands. And then we have a further damage that could be land dispossession, which is those who were forced to actually resign to the titles by force or threat or something like that. And those things are not exactly the same, right? First, you will have displacement. A lot of people flee communities, but not everybody has land. And then those who have land, maybe they can come back and claim it. Sometimes they actually have to file to the Oficina de Tierras, Restitución de Land Restitution Office in Colombia. And the dynamics that you see in those three are different. So I will encourage you to clarify conceptually and also empirically the difference between those factors, which are your dependent variable, right? Then another set of questions are related to the actors. Even though the argument is mostly about actors and elites, they're largely absent from the rest of the analysis. But who are these actors? Are we talking about politicians? And maybe this is Uribistas, right? Because they were closely connected to in power, but also economic elites. Or are we talking about businessmen? If that's the case, what sectors? And what is the connection between them at the very elite level? Political power, economic power. And then to further complicate the analysis, what is the connection between political, economic power and armed groups? In the particular case of Colombia, it's pretty clear, at least in the narratives, the close association between paramilitaries and some sectors of the right, political right, and their connection with economic power. But it's necessary to disentangle those connections more theoretically, right? I think you're heading in the right direction, but that needs to be fleshed out a little bit more. And also something very important related to the temporal sequence of events that need to be better fleshed out theoretically and also empirically, because that is very consequential. What happens first? I mean, my understanding of the narratives is that first you have armed actors moving in. Particularly the paramilitaries work a lot more like an occupation force, pretty much taking territories. Second is displacing people almost immediately. After that, we will have the land grabbing, and then you can break it out by land abandonment and then land dispossession, which is taking people out of their property rights. And after that is the palm oil growing. I'm not an expert on agriculture stuff at all, but the little research I've done about it is like usually it takes like about 4 years for a plant to actually start producing a palm oil plant. And after that, you have a cumulative effect, right? Because once you have this plantation that took you 4 years to actually plant and grow, you can have like 30 years of production out of that. So it's a very, very strong plantation once it's actually rooted. So those factors should be taken into account as you present the narrative and the theoretical connections around that. And eventually that should be reflected empirically. And the last theoretical comment, which is very important about the specific dynamics of conflict in Colombia about territorial control. Are we talking about that it's easier to move in areas that were not previously occupied by any other armed actor? Or do we see these dynamics more in terms of clashes between left-wing insurgent groups, and we have a variety of them, not only the FARC, versus another variety of armed groups, which are the plethora of paramilitary groups that we have. Sometimes they cluster around the Autodefensas Unidas de Colombia, but not always. So we're talking about fighting areas of territorial clashes where these two groups actually collide and displace back and forth each other. And if that is the case, are we talking about displacement as a product? And I think this is the most difficult part of the theoretical explanation. How to disentangle between people fleeing because of violence, because everybody's fighting in these territories with horrible episodes of violence, or if this is forced displacement for economic reasons, right? So I'm going to leave it there for the theoretical part, and then we can talk more about the data and the identification strategies if you want.
And Juan, you can go ahead and give a quick response if you like, or we can keep collecting feedback.
Great. No, these are awesome comments. Let me quickly respond here. So I think on the first point, the distinction between land grabbing and displacement, I definitely understand the distinction between abandonment, dispossession, and displacement. My interest is actually in showing how displacement, how what we might code as displacement, people just fleeing because they are afraid for their lives, or people being pushed out because a group is trying to expand its territory, how that might actually be, going to your last point, just being driven by economic motives and not by these sort of territorial ambitions. And so in terms of the empirics, I mean, to me, it's more interesting to focus on displacement as a variable rather than dispossession, because with dispossession or abandonment, we know that they were abandoned, or that these people were pushed out by some actor for their land. Whereas with displacement, at least on its face, we think that it's about something else. We think that it's about territorial expansion. And so here I'm trying to show actually some component of displacement is actually driven by economic motives. And in terms of who these actors might be, as a politicians, as a businessman, I'm certainly thinking about sort of the key actors here as being people who are in business, in agriculture, in big agricultural industries. Sometimes it's hard to parse out the distinction between drug traffickers, paramilitaries, and businessmen in Colombia, because these groups often overlap, particularly in rural areas where drug trafficking organizations have purchased a lot of land as a way to hide their investments and things of that nature. And then this question of the temporal sequence of events is actually a really important one that I've gotten before. Is it that we have territorial expansion, then abandonment, then palm oil growth? My sense of reading what's happening in Colombia is that you might have an area that already has some kind of agricultural production, maybe adjacent to palm oil. And then as this industry begins to grow, they begin pushing out people. So I guess I'm thinking about this as palm oil coming first and then the expulsion. But I know that empirically that's very, very hard to distinguish, because this is something that this is data that's aggregated at the yearly level. So around maybe the displacement coming first, but that would be really hard to distinguish. I'm not really sure how to deal with that, but it's something I have on my mind. And then, on your last point, this distinction between how do we really disentangle between people fleeing because there's lots of violence as opposed to this kind of displacement for economic reasons. I mean, that's essentially the whole gambit of the paper. That's what I'm trying to show. I'm hoping with the strategy, this diff and diff strategy, and then controlling for conflict dynamics, for the presence of guerrilla groups, which are the main sort of adversary of the paramilitaries, that controlling for these factors, if we still see an association between the growth of palm oil and displacement, that this displacement is then driven by economic factors and not necessarily territorial ones. Although I understand how difficult it is to actually show this. Yeah.
John?
Yeah, thanks so much for the opportunity to read and to talk about this really cool paper. I thought it was really interesting, a really neat identification strategy. I mostly have pretty sort of technical questions, a lot of them as well. I'll keep it to just maybe a couple, again, not to dominate the time here. And actually, the biggest one I wanted to emphasize was going on this issue of temporal disaggregation as well, because I think with the pooled strategy that you're pursuing right now, you're missing what could be some interesting dynamics to look at. So I was thinking about, this strategy of, so you come in to claim some land, and then presumably over time, and then you displace people to claim that initial parcel of land. Presumably that doesn't continue indefinitely on into the future, because at some point, if you're the big palm oil company, you're going to have all of the land in that area that you want. So presumably, if the story that you're telling about displacement is true, at least I would expect to see perhaps a very large uptick in displacement around that initial imposition of palm oil, perhaps a relatively high rate for a short period of time after that, and then a decline. And so I think it would be a very interesting sort of piece of additional evidence for the story that you're telling if you could get into a little bit of those temporal variation in rates of displacement within particular municipalities. That's sort of the big thing that I'll bring up now. I think the other thing I just wanted to mention on the instrumental variable analysis, I wonder about the exclusion restriction here, because some of these climatic factors, particularly elevation, may also be related to other kinds of conflict dynamics, the feasibility of insurgency, and so how you might think about sort of closing off some of those other avenues so that you have a strong instrument there. Yeah, many other questions as well. Can bring them up in discussion as we go on, or I can send them to you if you would like.
Great. Yeah, I would definitely love to get those comments by email later for sure. Yeah, the temporal duration of this palm oil effect is interesting. I have a different analysis where I use a generalized synthetic control method that actually lets me see sort of how this moves over time. And it actually seems like the peak of the effect is somewhere later. It's not immediate. It's a couple of years into adoption, which I'm not sure. Maybe that goes to actually Javier's comment about how long it takes to set up some of these plantations, or I don't know, something I still have to think through. It's not in the paper itself yet. And then on the climate instrument, I mean, I don't know that I would go to bat super hard for the climate instrument. And in general, there's some really good work out there showing that if you have a cross-sectional time series data and you have what is essentially a static instrument, something that only varies across municipalities, that is always going to be potentially confounded in that way. And so, I mean, I'm not sure what to do about it. I mean, I could also see removing the instrument entirely from the paper, but I think maybe some people want to see that as well. I don't know. I might push it to the appendix.
Okay, Thomas.
Great, thanks, Cassy, and thanks for organizing this. And this is really a great format. And thank you, Juan, for sending the paper. I think there's a lot of really cool stuff here, right? That people have been commenting on, and it's a really, really big question. And I really like the work here. I have a few questions, and like John said, so I could kind of go on for forever, and I'm going to try not to. But I want to just take kind of a couple main things that are actually more on the conceptual and theoretical side than the empirical one. In terms of the framing of the paper keeps on talking about itself as sort of discussing conflict dynamics, and displacement is certainly a conflict dynamic, right? But it does have a different dependent variable than other work that it's comparing itself to. right? So most of the work you're talking about is sort of the effect of growth on the onset of conflict, right? Or perhaps the effect of different economic shocks on insurgent violence. And another way to think about this, and which is part of the point of your paper, and Kalibas's point, which I'm really happy to see how you were able to work that work into this paper, is that this is actually about the effect on a certain kind of social violence that has, as Kalibas would say, has nothing to do with the war and goes on at times when war is not going on. Your point, your comparative static is that war makes it more likely. But you're not studying conflict dynamics, and so this is kind of I think I wonder if I'm getting a little too nitpicky here. But I think what the paper is actually about is a form of socioeconomic violence, and how war affects that socioeconomic violence and how often it happens. But the paper, I don't think, is about conflict dynamics in that sense, right? Conflict's the independent verb, right here, and so I just kind of wanted to kind of point that out because that gets me to a different point. Which is that in terms of then when we think about the contribution, then you're using a few different frames here in literatures, and I might want to clean this up because I think there's a lot going on in the paper. There's a displacement frame, there's an economics and violence frame. I'm a lot less convinced by the economics and violence frame, though I know you're dealing with that literature, right? It seems like there's a couple. The displacement frame is a slightly stronger one, particularly when you acknowledge there's all this stuff going on in anthro and investigative journalism that says that this happens, and we've never tested for it, and I can test for it in a way that we've never done before, right? So the influence of essentially on, and with palm oil, right, international corporations on social violence, right, right, which is a more provocative frame, but is more interdisciplinary. And then takes more seriously those strong journalistic and anthropological evidence that shows that this has been going on forever, in addition to historical evidence on Colombia, right? So I kind of like that frame more than this is another paper about economics and growth, which everyone's going to read and say, oh, okay, it's another paper on that. I don't know if it's exactly, or growth and violence, and I'm not exactly sure that's what you're doing, right? I think you can actually be a little bit more ambitious and more streamlined at the same time, and how you frame the contribution to the paper. But that gets me to another question, right? Which is, now, what I just said is that the comparative static is places that don't have war and places that do have war. That to my mind, the main thing you're saying is that the fog of war makes it more likely that these dynamics happen. Except that everything in Latin American history suggests that this happens all the time in places that don't have war and places that do have war. The experience of banana plantations on the Atlantic coast of Colombia, the experience of most of Central American history, CIA interventions in Central America. I'm going to be a little bit Marxist and lefty here for a minute, right? But the sort of the broad interpretation of the history of Latin America is that elites have predated, right, on the poor for its entire history, regardless of the presence of war or not. And so there's a little part of me that reads the paper and just really loves it. And there's another little part of me that reads the paper and says, yeah, but don't we already know this? Right? The Colombian, if we think about Colombia, right, to my mind, the main thing about Colombia is that it's a weak state in which elites have been able to exert control over local institutions through informal means to get what they want. The history, the 19th century, early 20th century history, and this is not stuff I know really, really well, but even just the origins of the FARC say that they were all in the 1960s veterans of land struggles, violent land struggles against rich elites who were taking their land, right? So this isn't necessarily maybe about the fog of war, but about a weak state that has been easily and informally controlled by rich elites who just happen to be in many places, right, the fair-skinned, more Spanish, right, sort of members of society, right? So that elite strata. So there's a part of me that says, is this really about the fog of war, or is this about the particular construction, informal and formal, of the state in Latin America? And again, I said I would sound lefty and Latin. I sound like a 1980s historian right now, which is weird for me. So bear with me. So I just can't get over that. What your paper actually means, what it actually tells us, may not be what I think it thinks it's telling us. And I'm going to need you to tell me how war has made this different. Because I think a lot of people who really know Colombian history well would say, well, read this and say, yeah, but this has happened at times before this particular war started. And it's a built-in bug to the way government has worked in Colombia, given the weak state that has been at times informally corrupted, right, by rich elites. So I'm really struck by that comparative static and theoretically then what the paper is actually telling us. One technical thing, or maybe two, or actually let me get out of the technical things because John did that better than I will. Let me just say a couple quick things about then. The paper has a lot going on right now. There's an experiment that we hear about for about 2 paragraphs. There's the survey data, there's the main workhorse municipio models, which is where the main focus of the paper actually is, right? And then you're trying to expand you're trying to have a theoretical frame here that tells us that I think only agricultural industries that are highly capital intensive should have this effect, right? So the effect should be different in industries that are not as in agricultural crops that are not capital intensive the way palm oil is, right? Because we see this dynamic in palm oil in Indonesia, for example, where we see large scale displacements of peasants there as well, right? So you've got a lot going on, and I'm wondering about how you hide it, how you maybe hide the paper away, because I think there are a few things here that you don't just have enough time to explain, and the paper is really ambitious, and I'm thinking about how you might streamline that. But that's enough from me. I've gone on too long. Sorry.
No, thank you. Those are awesome comments. Yeah, I feel very seen in those comments. I'm definitely needing to figure out how to make some choices about where to take the paper. I do think that I'm sort of going in many different directions at once because I am interacting with these different literatures, right? There's this whole literature on displacement. Originally, the paper, as I thought about it, was just about displacement. But then sort of, some feedback I got along the way pushed me in the direction of thinking more about this, economic growth and conflict angle and the Dalbo and Dalbo model and, commodity shocks and this kind of thing. So yeah, definitely I need to think for sure about how to make some choices about where to go and narrow the paper down a little bit. Let me think about this. So the other big comment I thought you had that I've been thinking about a lot is, what exactly is different about this situation from sort of status quo land grabbing we see in the developing world, where just elites take land from people in different ways? I would imagine that maybe part of the answer is the scale at which this happens in wartime settings. Maybe it's just much different. I'm not sure how I would sort of test that in the Colombian context. I think the other part of this that really resonates with me is that, and maybe this goes to the displacement angle and reframing the paper more as about displacement, but we really think about displacement. All the literature on displacement is really about politics and about two sides pushing each other out, pushing supporters out of different areas so they can expand territorial control. And I think displacement in Colombia is seen very much this way. But I think the argument I'm trying to make here is, some of this displacement is actually motivated just purely by economic self-interest in the same way that land grabbing is. So yeah, I don't know. But those are great questions. I don't have great answers, but I'm definitely going to think about them.
So Juan, I also think all these comments are amazing, and I'm so glad that we're all here and, not flying around the world just to have this great conversation. But yes. I think that all of these comments do really nicely fit together, which will hopefully be really productive for you. And my big question was similar to the one you just got, which is, how has war made this different? So I kind of went off into Latin American history land as well and was like, yes, like elites are terrible. There we go. We see it again. And I do think you're sort of stretching across literatures in a way that is perhaps sort of muddling your concepts rather than helping them. And it also links back to the question I think you're getting about the temporality of your not just analysis, but really of understanding the case. And so I don't know the answer to Javier's question about kind of who comes first. We have some perhaps anecdotal or qualitative evidence. I'm not sure what was being referenced, but that maybe paramilitaries come through, and then there's the industry, and so there's these layers of actors entering into these spaces. And I think if you can just sort of do the work, whether that's reading more qualitative work or reading maybe really local newspaper accounts of what has been happening in the area, and get a better sense of not just who the actors are, but how and when and at what time they're entering into the space that then creates displacement at the civilian level, you'll be able to tell a much tighter story about how this does or does not really relate to war. And so your writing that sort of tries to have this fog of war story is weakened because those temporal dynamics are not really clarified, and that fits into with the actors not being super clarified and not knowing what is the civilian who's going to be displaced seeing, what happens to them. Is to them this really about industry, or is this about industry taking advantage of the so-called fog of war and coming in and just doing what they do best, which is apparently run lives. So I hope that helps sort of bring some of these together, and maybe you can respond to that, or sort of give us an idea of what else might be helpful to collect comments or to talk about those issues.
Yeah, thanks. That's a nice summary of what everyone said. I think what resonates with me a lot is figuring out what specific direction I want to take the paper and make that story clearer. And then the temporality question, it's vague in the paper now, and I think in part it's vague because I knew that there was no way I was going to be able to adjudicate the order of things with the data that I had, and so I sort of left it ambiguous. And I think when I actually dig into the case and read firsthand accounts of this, I actually find both accounts. The account where paramilitaries sweep in and just clear everything out, and then we got palm oil. And then in some other settings, for example, where you already have agricultural industry in place, and those elites, those people in business in those industries, want to switch from whatever they were growing before to palm oil, for example, from banana plantations to palm oil, and that expansion being linked to displacement. And so I don't know, it's one of those things where the cases are always so messy, and there's the more you do it, the less sure you are what exactly is happening sometimes. But yeah, I think making the story clearer, making the actors clearer, sort of just staking my claim more firmly on who I think is doing this, even if maybe the data itself doesn't perfectly point to those people or that sequence of events.
Other comments?
I kind of like that as an idea, Juan, and actually, I might even make I don't know if I would go quite this far. I'm not sure, like how sure I am about what I'm about ready to say, but it might make sense to maybe think about dumping the survey stuff. I mean, the survey stuff is really, really interesting, but imagine that if you could do the work that you do, say with the municipio level results, and then say, now I'm going to try to unpack the causal mechanisms with the qualitative accounts, and then work through and say, there might be two different mechanisms here that might be working in these different ways, and future work should, unpack this more, right? But then you have a more streamlined paper. It's not that I don't like the survey stuff. I just think that it's probably, compared to what you already have, it's not adding as much as I think a sort of a more careful, sort of pairing the qualitative with the quantitative evidence would do. I'm not entirely sure exactly how confident I am about that, but it would lead to a more streamlined paper that's kind of focused on this one, on the particular causal mechanisms you're most interested in.
Yeah, I would second that. I think you could get a lot of mileage out of dropping or at least de-emphasizing the survey stuff and then adding in more qualitative stuff along the lines of what Cassy was suggesting. Because I found like the sort of the very, very brief kind of ethnographic, bit you had there close to the end, actually quite compelling. And so I think if you emphasize that a little bit more, because we've got kind of the general, quantitative picture from sort of your first set of results. And so if you can really get into that the story of those mechanisms more, I think that will really strengthen the paper.
Great, thanks.
I have in addition to these comments, generally the discipline is pretty resistant to innovations. So I would say put one innovation per paper, not 3, 4, because then you open many battlefronts that you can actually defend well. And you can use that research for another papers, like spin-offs of this larger project. I'm talking about the survey and the endorsement experiment. More specific recommendations, and you can take as many of these as you can, actually. First one, try to expand the time horizon. You're analyzing 93 to 05. You have a lot more data forward. Backwards is harder to get, and I understand that, but moving forward, you have like at least 10, 15 years worth of data that you can incorporate as part of the analysis. Focusing on the dependent variable, I will say, yes, take, in addition to just getting people pushed out, also take the data from the land restitution office in Colombia to bring a dependent variable of land, right? I mean, a lot of the narrative theoretically is land, and there's like some need of disentangling displacement and land. Just use them both as dependent variables. Maybe you get interesting leverage there. Also for the main independent variables, I will say bring more data. And there's one of the advantages of Colombia is that if you have so much data about armed actors, you have like at least 3, really maybe 4 solid databases on different armed groups. Just be explicit. Who are you taking the data from for the Autodefensas Unidas de Colombia, the ASU, and there are other actors, other measures. I'm doing an analysis on similarity of different databases, and they kind of overlap about 30% of the time. So nobody's actually really measuring the same thing, even though we all claim that, right? But just better measures of paramilitaries. Also control for a bunch of other armed actors on the left side of conflict, I mean, because it's not only the FARC, we have M19, particularly in this period, we have the ELN, and we also have these other Bakrim groups that are just like popping up and emerging actually around this time, and they're also conducting a lot of violence. So basically, bring a lot of the different actors related to violence on into the paper. Also, very importantly, the political actors are missing here from the analysis. I know it's hard to get, but maybe as proxies, try to get maybe information about Uribistas who were in Congress, who actually were elected from these areas, or probably the voting percentage of the presidential elections related to Uribe at the municipal level, right? That should give you some idea of strength or support or connections to the political power. To try to close the circle between paramilitaries and the political elites or actors related to this conflict dynamics in the broader context of the theater of the armed conflict between left and right. In addition to that, I will say try to bring a lot more, especially to disentangle the argument of this is a social control or economic motivated strategy. Try to disentangle that from the conflict scene. So the model should have a bunch of control variables for violence. Things that we know displace people, right? Homicides, attacks, bombs, mines. I mean, those are pretty indiscriminate violence that people just flee when you see these things coming into town. Definitely economic factors. I know that poverty measures are hard to get by in Colombia because they only get a sample of municipalities, but at least try to get GDP at the department level. Demographic factors too. And also more on the agricultural side, soil, it's crucial, right? Not all the crops grow everywhere. So you might have some geographic constraints that actually might be very important given the type of soil, the altitude, that might make these dynamics more prominent. And just a couple more minutes as recommendations. The identification strategy, climate might be endogenous given these soil characteristics that these crops need. So why don't go back to the already well-proven strategy of actually taking international prices as exogenous shocks that eventually have an impact on these communities, and you cite a lot of research that is actually doing this kind of strategy, and it kind of works, right? So it's just don't invent the wheel. Try to use these international prices of palm oil in the global market and see what is the effect that it has on the dynamics of conflict after controlling for all these factors that I mentioned. And also something that is not really addressed here, but you might also have, given the expansion of land, some special econometric opportunities here, like contagious effects. Once you have palm oil in a municipality, how likely is it to actually expand? Because as businessman, you want to build communities of scale, right? You try to expand your lots in the way that maximize profit, and by doing that, you try to get land as close as possible to the original spot. So maybe trying to bring in some special econometric models, and there's some interesting, especially in the instrumental variables model that you can take into account in terms of geographic expansion of some spots. And I will stop there. Definitely take the survey out and the survey endorsement experiment for another papers, because that's super interesting. Right.
Great, thanks.
I just had if I don't mind, if people don't mind, I'm just going to piggyback on Javier, his question for just a second, because it was another way you might be able to streamline the paper, Juan, is table 2 on the effect of palm oil growth on wages. Strikes me as sort of, you introduce a new analysis that goes by really, really quickly, and we're not in a position to judge, what this is actually showing us because you're having to explain it so quickly. And it strikes me that why not, and I'm probably missing something, and you're smarter at this stuff than I am, Juan, so why not control for wages in table 1? Right, because you're not in an argument about whether the palm oil industry affects wages. You don't care about that argument. That's not what you care about. What you care about is whether wages are the path through which are the causal path, not the causal path that you're saying. You do care about that, but then that means that controlling for wages in your mean regression model should be what you do. Because if that knocks out the effect of palm oil, then that's telling us that the effect of palm oil is dependent on wages. Right. So I'm just wondering a little bit about why not insert some of the alternative mechanisms. So as Javier suggested, presidential results in the last president. Right. So did they vote conservative or did they vote more liberal? Right. For most of the elections and where you'd be looking at, it's still the traditional 2-party system. Right. So wages. Right. Or maybe, and then you have FARC presence, but you could be controlling for like the amount of violence or casualties, right, as opposed to FARC presence, which might give us a sense of whether this is about people fleeing the violence, right? But I wonder if you could be controlling for these alternative mechanisms, still have a short list of controls, I think, but whether controlling for these alternative mechanisms would be nice, and then you get to get rid of table 2 and streamline the entire paper further. I might be missing the point here, but that's just one suggestion that could help streamline.
Oh, that's a good question. It's actually it's a matter of the data sets being different. So with the income data, the wages, I'm using a panel survey that was only available for a smaller subset of years. But I totally agree with actually just getting rid of table 2. I could push table 2 to the appendix, maybe, where I could describe more in depth what's actually happening there. I just wanted to head off sort of that criticism that, well, this is actually just about poverty, because even though it doesn't quite make sense, right? Why would poverty cause displacement? But, maybe it's about poverty because we know that, palm oil has this sometimes devastating effect on local economies, right? So, but I get it. It's why have this whole table in the paper, in the middle of the paper for this robustness test. I think this question of the politicians and support for Uribe, I'm not really quite sure what to make of it. I mean, if the story is that, these if elites in business are, pushing people out to expand their land holdings, essentially, and they are elites, and so they have connections to, politicians, and they are from parts of the country that are, like Uribe's backyard, right? I mean, what would it mean that we control for these politicians or these political sort of associations and the effect changes in some way. I guess I'm not quite sure in the causal chain, like where are these politicians? Maybe that's something I need to figure out for myself and make clear in the paper. Yeah.
Okay, so we have reached our time. Juan, if you don't have any final closing statements you want to say, then I will do my closing.
I will say thank you all. These are great comments. And this format is so awesome when you think about what just happened here versus what happens at like a big national conference. Is pretty incredible. So thanks everyone.
Yes, likewise. Thank you all. Those comments were really amazing, and it's fun to see new research coming out on great topics like Juan is covering. So good job all. I do need to plug that our next talk is on November 15th for those who might be interested. And if anyone's watching this and they want to learn more about our colloquium, there's information on the Peace Science Society website. So with that, we will sign off and we'll post this talk on YouTube later today. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. Thanks.
Bye.
See you later.